Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Um, Welcome to the session of the 2021 Climate Action Pursuits February milestone. This is a set of programming, as with all Pursuit milestones this year, that is designed to support each of you in advancing your institution's journeys toward climate justice and resilience. And to that end, our session will include elements to inform, inspire, and support your work along your journey as a leader in this critically important space. So with that, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jochebed Boganjoko. I'm the founder at Jayadika Consulting, where I work with institutional investors to help them understand the moral and macro risk of racist inequities, how they show up in the portfolio, and then what they can do to begin to build strategies that address and ultimately eliminate those disparities. And I also work with the Responsible Business Initiative for Justice as their investor advocacy consultant, working with them to mobilize investors around the issue of criminal justice. I'm speaking to you today from Charlotte, North Carolina on occupied ISWA land. And along with that, I would also just like to acknowledge the fact that we are living through a pandemic, and there are many people who can't participate in this conversation, not just because they're no longer with us, but because they are incarcerated, they're the subject of this conversation, or just because they have lost homes and jobs and aren't in a position to participate in the way that we are privileged to be able to. So just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge those. And if we could all mute while we're in discussion, I'll quickly go through just a couple more logistics. Our session will be recorded, so you should be able to access in the future. And as we're having this conversation, please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, to ask questions, or just to be a part of the conversation. And from there, I'll introduce the other panelists that you'll be hearing from today. We'll go into some slides that'll provide some context on what we're having our conversation about. And then from there, we'll actually go into the discussion. So if I could just welcome the other panelists to the stage. We have Rebecca Cannon, who's the managing attorney at the law office of Rebecca B. Cannon. We have Ivy Jack, who's the head of equity research at Northstar Asset Management. We have Renee Morgan, who's a social justice strategist at Adesina Capital. And we have Patience Miriam Iqbal, who's the founder and CEO at Women of the World Endowment. So these are all really leaders in prison-free investing space, and I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation with you all. I can't wait to hear everything that you're gonna contribute to the conversation. So from there, I will just go quickly into some background information if I can figure out how to share my screen. This session, Racial Equity Investing, No Justice, No Peace Without Prison-Free Portfolios. The title for this really came from my experiences this summer during the protests that I think we're all aware of. I actually happened to meet Rebecca doing jail support at 4 a.m. across the street from the Mecklenburg County Jail, helping people who were being released at all hours of the day with dead phones, who often just had no idea where they were. And this was really my first experience working directly with people who had been incarcerated. And this is not at all where I started in terms of my journey with this conversation. And I wanted to give that background because I think it's important context in terms of thinking about how you approach this work. So when I first moved to the US, I was an immigrant, moved to South Carolina, and the way that I understood Blackness really was related to TV and jokes about crime. So I grew up hearing things like, oh, what do you call a group of Black men running down a hill? You call that a jailbreak. And so that's how I really understood Blackness and informed the way I thought about crime and people as I grew up. And it was only as I had experiences that brought me closer to those who were directly impacted that I really began to understand this as an issue that related to me specifically. When I lived in San Francisco, for example, I lived in a part of the city that is full of homeless people and had conversations with them for the first time, and also experienced mental health emergencies myself. And so when you hear stories about Tatiana Jefferson, for example, began to see that this could have been me. And so felt a personal responsibility to really engage. And from there, I'm at the place now where I understand prison as sort of our modern day abolition moment, an opportunity to let go of outdated and ineffective harmful systems that reinforce a racial caste system, both through economic conditions, the economic outcomes of prisons, and then through the social outcomes in terms of stereotypes and justifications for racism. So this is an opportunity for us to embrace new models that are centered around restorative practices and reducing harm. And so I provide all of this context because as much as this is an investing conversation, you can't remove that really from the broader social context that informs where we are. So with that, I'll just define racial equity investing. So that's developing business practices that support the long-term success of all stakeholders by proactively identifying and counteracting racial inequities within a firm, and allocating capital to intentionally and measurably address systemic racist inequities in social, environmental, and economic outcomes of their operations. And so that means that this area in terms of the prison industrial complex where inequities are so drastic and have such drastic consequences becomes a key issue when we're thinking about racial equity and when we're thinking about that from an investing perspective. Racial equity being conditioned where inequities have been remedied such that one's origin, racial or ethnic identity has no influence on how they fare in society. So that requires that we recognize that inequities exist, that they must be remedied before we can get to a place ultimately of justice, where we've gone through that process of healing, of accountability and atonement, and have reached a place where we can actually start to treat people equally, where everyone can be treated the same. So equity recognizes that right now we're not all starting from that same position, and that requires that we do the work of eliminating those inequities. And in terms of some context around prison and the prison industrial complex in the US, I wanted to give two quotes. So this first one is from Julia Brown. She was a former slave who was interviewed in 1936 by the Federal Writers Project. And she, in her interview, shares her experience of what slaves called paddy rollers or patrollers, which were precursors to policing systems in the South. So you can read her experience for yourself and sort of the way they're related to this group of organized men who would patrol and keep slaves in line for fear of insubordination and insurrection. And this really struck me as I think about sort of where we've come as a country because of how she ends with, "We were afraid to go anywhere." And the way that this system was more than just individual experiences. It was a broader tool for social control, for economic control in terms of keeping property in its place, property being human beings, and then social control in terms of keeping people in their place socially. And fast forward to, apologies. Fast forward to 1960s, and this same function, the same way of thinking about race as a means of defining people as legal or not, shows up again as we think about how the Nixon campaign used stereotypes and this idea of Blackness and Black people as criminal in order to both boost his own political capital and expand what we'll ultimately see becomes the prison industrial complex. And I think that it's really important to consider the ways that we think about criminality and who is a criminal, thinking about robbery, larceny, burglary, for example, compared to wage theft, which is also a crime, and in terms of value, significantly dwarfs that of the types of crimes that we tend to think of when we think of a criminal. And so I think understanding that how we think about criminality and who is a criminal has been a narrative that's been carefully constructed in order to support certain interests. And then when we talk about the prison industrial complex, what we're talking about is the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. And so here you have just a chart that shows the extent to which people are incarcerated across the country, but in the federal, state, and local jails. And then when we're talking about the industrial complex, this is more than just the people in beds in these institutions. It's also the ways in which governments, as you can see on the right side, actually advertise their labor to corporations as a means of reshoring manufacturing, for example. And so it goes beyond the actual buildings to the corporations who then contract labor from prisons and jails, the corporations who profit from the services they provide, et cetera. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the prison industrial complex. So now that I've provided some of that background, let's share the poll results so we can see some of where people were coming when they entered this conversation. If you don't mind sharing that kind of. So we should all be able to see this. Despite making up close to 5% of the global population, the US has nearly, the correct answer is 25% of the world's prison population. So you can see the extent to which we disproportionately use incarceration as a tool for our problems compared to other parts of the world. And then since 1970, our incarcerated population has increased by 700%. There are 2.3 million people in jail and prison today, far outpacing population growth in crime. And that's true, which it seems we're all aware of. And then the last question, incarceration rates remain stable at approximately 100 per 100,000 US residents from 1920s to 1960s. This rate doubled by the mid 1980s and quadrupled by the 2000s. By 2020, nearly 2.3 million individuals are locked up in US prisons, jails, and detention. So again, we see that this is something that is not a constant sort of feature of our society, but has been managed and has grown once again to serve certain interests. So from there, we'll go into the discussion, and I'd love to move back to our panelists and have each of you just quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do and sort of what brought you to this conversation and to the work as well. So if we could start with you, Rebecca.
Greetings. First of all, my name is Rebecca Cannon, and it is an absolute honor to be here today. And just to answer the initial question, the reason why I started doing the work that I do is because slavery still exists. Slavery was not extinguished with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment made slavery an exception. And we see that now today in the prison industrial complex and in the term that we are now using as called mass incarceration. And also what a lot of people don't realize is that slavery still exists even in our state constitutions. And going to law school, I knew that I wanted to be a part of the solution. And so when I went to law school, I'm like, lots of people. You'll talk to lots of lawyers, and lots of people may want to go for the prestige and the money that may be associated with having the title as counselor at law. But I went because I wanted to be a public defender. And so I spent time in the public defender's office. I call it the trenches, actively supporting my clients, helping them navigate through the justice system that was not fair to them. And as Jochebed stated, that is how we met during this global pandemic at Jail Support. Jail Support, just briefly, was a 24-hour mutual aid hub that we created in Charlotte to assist protesters that were getting arrested and being released, but also to help people that were leaving the local jails in the middle of the night, in the middle of a pandemic where there were little to no resources. And so with courts being closed, my practice had to shift from, being a public defender that could only defend people in the court. We had to actually go out into the streets and do that work. So I am an attorney. My firm now, we're an abolitionist-based firm, and we're committed to doing the work to liberate poor people, Black and brown people all over.
Thank you. And then Ivy? I'm having trouble hearing you, Ivy. Is anyone else having that? We'll let you work on that, and then we'll move to Renee and come back to you, Ivy.
Hi, I'm Renee Morgan. I'm as Jochebed said, I'm the social justice strategist at Adesina Social Capital. I bridge the gap between social justice organizations and the investing world for our firm. Why I got into this is, it's a long story, but I'm old enough to have been alive when Rodney King was beat up by the police in California, and I was living in California at the time. So that was a profound experience for me in my early 20s. And so I had an awakening there, and then got buried in a lot of my privilege. And, as you can see, I'm white, and, all of the things that we're taught, as Jochebed said, which feels so painful about what Blackness represents, or like how people are taught what Blackness is, was certainly my experience as well. And so Rodney King really shifted that. But then again, in 2014 with the murder of Michael Brown, it resurfaced again for me. And so personally, I was doing a lot of street activism, a lot of jail support, as Jochebed and Rebecca were also speaking of here during the protests in 2014 and 2015. But I've been in the ESG space. And so I started working to dismantle mass incarceration within our portfolios professionally around 2015. So I've been doing this work on the streets at night and by day in the investing world in the portfolios. So yeah, that's what brought me here. And I mean, really fundamentally, with every cell of my being, I do not believe we're going to solve any problems with the people that created them. And so there's no way that we can continue to be led with a white male viewpoint when those are all the viewpoints that created all the problems that got us here. And so following the leadership, particularly of Black and brown women, the people most impacted are the people that actually know all of the ills of the problems themselves and have somehow survived and managed to create solutions. And those are the people that we need to be listening to.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. This is part of what I wanted to center in this conversation, was both Rebecca's experiences with clients, and then this idea that we talked about that, we can't be led to freedom by the people who created chains. So what is it going to take for us to start listening to those who have been held in those chains and valuing their voices and their contributions as valuable? So thank you. And Ivy, can we hear you now?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
Okay. Well, I'll say my coming to this work was somewhat different for me. I will say the work found me. I didn't find the work per se, in the sense that I work for North Star Asset Management, which is a progressive wealth management firm. And I would say our CEO kind of had a revelation during the Great Recession and decided that she needed to diversify her firm. And so the firm actually found me. But what I will say I think is important, I was born and raised in Louisiana, in an area where there are many what I will call forced labor camps. And these forced labor camps have been preserved. My great-great-grandparents were enslaved people, and many of the forced labor camps, which are also known as plantations, are also located in an area known as Cancer Alley due to the number of large petrochemical plants that are located in the area, and as a result, there are high rates of cancer. So even though the work found me, I would say that my roots are part of who I am and shape my thoughts and opinions on this work. So with that being said, in a nutshell, that's just kind of how I came to this work. But one thing I will say is that, even though I come from people who were enslaved, I myself have realized that I still have a lot of work to do in terms of unlearning, I think, some of the things that I have learned simply by being educated in predominantly white institutions, even though I did go to a historically Black college, and also from having worked on Wall Street for a decade and then also in corporate America.
Thank you. I think that's unlearning is so much of this work. I think even just realizing that so many of the people in prison are there because they're poor and can't afford to pay a fine or a fee, and not because of some personal failing, I think is something that really helped me as I was learning this. So thank you for bringing that up. On patience, last but not least.
Thank you. So thank you very much for having me, and it's fantastic to be part of this conversation. Every time I have this conversation, I always start with the fact that for me, it's personal. I happen to be the mother of two Black men. They're 17 and 18. And I used to feel when they were younger that we could protect them. But as they get older, I recognize that, there's no protecting young Black men in this country. And it makes me emotional every time I say that.
Yeah, this is part of the cost of the work. It's not just the cost of building buildings. It's the cost of experiencing this every day. So thank you, Patience, for being open.
So that was unexpected. I'm sorry. That was how I lived through 2020 after Mr. Floyd was killed. I wept literally every day. And that was the beginning of my involvement in this work. So I run an entity, I founded an entity and run an entity that is focused on investing at the intersection of gender and some of today's most pressing problems. And that includes environmental problems and social problems, including racial justice. We are very intentional about, yes, making returns, but it's very intentional about making sure that every dollar that we invest does a number of things, including drive for deep impact. We also really understand the role of capital and how capital can be used for good or bad. I spent my career, I was born in Zimbabwe and moved to the US over 30 years ago. But I was born into a country that was actually under colonial rule. So I understand what not having means. But coming to the US and going to law school, I was going to be a human rights lawyer, and spent my first summer doing some work, human rights work in South Africa, before South Africa was actually, before their independence. And recognize that you could tell people that they had rights, but at the end of the day, the economic status really made a big difference. So I decided at that time to go to business school as well, and to work at the intersection of economics and human rights. And so that's the work that I do, really interrogating the role of capital in some of the things that we live with today, some of the challenges that we live with today that need to be dismantled. And so that's the voice that I bring to this, the voice of a mother who has 2 Black boys, 2 Black men, as well as somebody who understands quite deeply and has been investing at the frontier of economic and human rights challenges.
Thank you, and thank you again for sharing so openly. And it's all part of what I hope we can discuss today. Is that context? I think to Rebecca, one of the things that I'd love for us to discuss is the ways in which poverty is such a big part of what actually drives incarceration in this country. So the average income of people before they're incarcerated is about $19,000 a year. And so the ways in which not being able to afford fines or fees plays into a long-term cycle of poverty and incarceration. Would love for you to talk about your experiences both this summer in relation to that, and then with your clients generally, the ways that they experience that.
Thank you. I want to apologize. My camera has been going on and off because I have been extremely emotional this morning. Very happy to be here and talk about these things. But when I have to dig deep into my vault and go down and think of the stories that, costs my clients a lot, that changes their everyday lives beyond what we can even imagine, and what people that invest in these prison systems even know or allow themselves to understand. It pains me to have to dig deep into that vault. So thank you for being vulnerable, patience, and y'all excuse me if I'm a little vulnerable. But speaking to your question, the client, the person that comes to mind, he's allowed me to share his story, and his name, I call him Mr. Edward. And I was working at the ACLU, and we were working on a specific project, and that project was to address the debtors prison that we see in North Carolina, and that's where people are held in jails and prison, and mainly jails, for the inability to pay fines and fees. So a lot of times these people, these may be something as simple as driving infractions, tickets that they've not paid. This could be restitution that may be associated with really old cases. And because these people, they're never taken into account the people's ability to pay initially, our clients are given these enormous amounts of money that they need to pay. And they're trying to maintain how to survive, how to feed their families and provide, and then pay these astronomical court fees that are not fair to begin with. And so the first person that comes to mind is Mr. Edward. I was working at the ACLU. We were looking for people to tell their stories. And sometimes you're not always approachable as a lawyer when you come in your suit and you're saying, hey, do you owe the court money? I want to help you. So people are not necessarily always trusting and responsive, but with this particular person, the judgment had been entered 10 years ago. He was actually physically disabled. He only had one leg that he was able to use. He was injured in an accident and was not receiving disability. He had done a prison sentence to be released to still owe restitution. This is a nonviolent crime, restitution in the amount of, I want to say $8,000. He's literally been on probation for 8 years. The day that I happened to meet him, his mom had died prior to, and he was going to jail had he not come up with some type of payment. He had complied with all the regulations of probation, which are really taxing on people, and they were going to lock him up, and I was able to help him and address the court. But the issue is that, he didn't have a job. He's physically disabled. he'd served his time, but he's still dealing with the repercussions of the court system. And so that's why I don't use the term mass incarceration. I use the term slavery, because the chains that people still have on them, even when they're released, those are heavy and those are long lasting. Speaking a little bit to some of the experiences this summer, we were in the middle of a global pandemic, and people needed aid. And meanwhile, it was community that came together to provide this for the people that were coming out of the jail, and making sure that they had access to basic things like a bus pass to get transportation home, a charger to charge their phone, a snack. Some people were taken into jail with injuries that they were not treated for in the jail. Injuries as serious as gunshot wounds, that when they were able to be released from jail support, we were able to provide that care and aid for them. And so going into jail and prison, it's not something that, should be taken lightly. It's not something that we can invest in and expect to make people better. It doesn't make people better. And it's really, really tough on people, even something as simple as just not having enough money to get an ID, or not having an address to even send an ID to even begin to work. And so those are all things that we've seen. And over the summer, it was a lot worse because of the killing of George Floyd and the killing of Breonna Taylor. For many Black and brown people, the idea of being killed by the police in your home or in the street while other people watch, that was not the first time we thought about that this summer. For many people, we live in that fear. We may not decide that we don't want to go places, but when we do go, we have that constant fear in us of what an interaction with the police would lead to, because we're Black and brown. And for people that are poor, it's a lot harder. So I hope I answered your question, but it's really a lot to unpack. But if you're thinking about the actual human, the actual person, you'll realize that investing in prisons is never the answer, when we should be really investing in people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you brought up several good points in terms of people who fail to find services elsewhere often end up then in prison, right? Because they couldn't find housing, or they couldn't find some other service. And in this time of COVID, that's been especially relevant because multiple states have ended up giving the bulk of their COVID relief funding to policing and prisons. And, when you talk about astronomical costs, it might not be $8,000, could be $100. But personally, I've been driving and followed around for miles on end by police, and that leaves me every time I drive unsure of if I'm going to come home alive, right? But I can afford to pay $100 fee if there is some license infraction. With COVID, we've seen multiple people who have actually died in prison unconvicted because they couldn't pay that fee. So if you could talk a little bit, I think you spoke to this somewhat, but how you'd like investors to think about the ways that they're profiting from the building of these buildings, the surveillance that comes out of the process, from the labor that's being done while people are incarcerated.
You have to think about it as you're impacting people. There are 2.3 million people that are in prison, but if you understand, if you work with people that are impacted by the criminal system, you realize that that number is not right. There's way more people that are impacted. People's families are impacted, their mothers, their fathers. And if you think about that and you start there, you realize that you'll never be able to benefit from profitizing into prisons. If you think about the punishment, I think Ivy spoke to that just a little bit. People are forced to work in prison. It's not an option for them. And some places in Georgia and Arkansas, they're not even provided a wage for that. People are working in jails, growing food, working for these companies, cleaning, and they're making 40 cents a day. And then they're still having to pay for things that they need in the prison system that they lack access to. There's no way to actually make sure people are treated like humans in there based on the present system and the structure that we have now. That is why, as an abolitionist, abolition is the only way, because knowing that the history of how we got here and that police were the slave catchers that patrol people, and that the prisons that the plantations are our actual prisons now, knowing that we can't continue that way. And so what we have to do is make sure that the people that are investing in these prisons, make sure that you know that these are real people that are really actually impacted by this. You think about the lack of access that people are going to have to things when they come out, and you don't realize how their time spent in there impacts them in those ways. So I think that the main point is that we can't invest in those things, and we should be looking to invest in reentry programs and things that actually contribute to people's success and in the community, opposed to making it harder for them by funding these prisons that don't provide the aid or the support that they need to come out and contribute to society.
Yeah. This is impact investing, right? So we need to be thinking about ultimately the people that are being impacted. And I think moving to you, Ivy, that's some of how you got started in this work, right? As a client who was thinking about those impacts and wanted to explore how that could relate to their portfolio.
Yeah, but before I address how we kind of got into this work, I just want to give a little anecdote or story to kind of drive home some of what Rebecca mentioned. As I mentioned, I was born and raised in Louisiana, and in Louisiana, some of the state buildings, the people who were running the cafeterias, who were doing the cleaning, these are all people who are currently in prison or in jail. And I have, I'll just say, I have a family member who works at the state capitol, and they were talking to me on the phone, and they were going around and telling me, I drove up to the state capitol and I was early for work, and, the security guards hadn't gotten there, but thank goodness, one of the prisoners was there because they were able to let me in. And the person just kept on talking. But in my mind, I sat there and thought to myself, I was like, hold on, let me get this straight. You showed up early, and you were grateful because you were able to get in the building because one of the people who was in prison or jail had to get to the Capitol early. Because like I said, they work in the cafeteria, and they were able to let you in. So to me, that says something right there in terms of how these people are viewed, and in terms of, the fact that if this person is trustworthy enough to open up the facilities and run the cafeteria, why are they working in the state building for free? So again, I just think that gives you more context around, when I started, I refused to call plantations because they were forced labor camps. And I think that helps people better understand what the situation is and how what we have today is really not very different, in the sense that you still have people who are working for free, and who and I'll be frank, because you saw this, I saw this growing up in Louisiana, it was only when I moved away that I started to think myself like, oh my gosh, this isn't normal. This isn't right. So it took even me, I think, moving away to really understand that some of the things that you see every day aren't right. And to be frank, I think living in Louisiana sometimes, there are things that we see in front of us, but if we took too much time to think about what we were seeing, I know I personally, we just couldn't function. So I want to go back to the question I was asked: how did we get into this work at North Star? North Star is a progressive wealth management firm. Our clients are high net worth individuals and mission-driven organizations. And one of our clients, who was in graduate school, I think might have been in law school, who was working in Louisiana and working in the courts and law enforcement system, came to us and pointed this out as a topic that he was interested in. And, you know, he wanted to know what work we were doing. We started a research project. And one of the things that we found out was that there is prison in the supply chain of corporations, but it's not simple in terms of just saying, and I'm using a company that everybody knows. So for example, take Costco, which by the way, is where we filed our first shareholder proposal on prison labor. You know, Costco, some of the produce that you see in Costco has been picked by prison labor. Now, Costco is not directly engaging with the prison. They are going through different entities that are the entities themselves have the relationships with the prisons. And so sometimes it's not necessarily obvious for a corporation to know that, oh my gosh, there's prison in my supply chain. The corporation has to actually go and do the work and see. And to be quite honest, in our country, a lot of corporations, they don't want to know. Therefore, they aren't doing the work. And so part of our work in terms of filing our shareholder proposal at Costco was asking them to do the work. You know, we know that there is prison in your supply chain. We want you to go find out about it. We want you to understand what are the conditions that these people are working under. Are they getting paid? Are they being trained? Like, are you helping them to be successful on the way out? So I will say for us, you know, when we file shareholder proposals, you know, we are really trying to get corporations to understand what is happening to the best that we can, and to make sure that they understand that you are using forced labor, and to make the connection to slavery, and to then take another step and say, you know, what are you going to do about it? And so what I will say is that work has led to other work that we are doing. So we are still continuing to trying to uncover other corporations that might have prison in their supply chain. And we are doing that through requesting information, but we have to do it by the state level, because that's something else I think we should talk about in terms of prisoners at the federal level, the state level, and then even further at the local municipal level in terms of the jails. One of the things that we are advocating for now is second chance hiring programs. So, you know, if you are going to use prison labor, well, then why don't you have a second chance hiring program so that when these people are out of prison, they have work? Other work that I would think in terms of our activism that has come out of this is us also looking at, I would say, racial equity in a more holistic way. So even though we are very focused on the prison industrial complex and our position is abolition, we are also looking at what are other ways besides purely just looking at our companies that we own in our portfolio and asking them to be honest about what's happening, that we as a whole can fully be on board with what it means to really work for racial equity in terms of everything we do throughout the operations of our organization.
Thank you. I think you brought.
And I apologize. Yeah, I'm trying to adjust my light as we talk here.
The day is passing you by. I think you brought up the really good point that corporations often don't want to know. And so that then requires an investor who's interested in this work to do a lot of that learning so that you can then go to the corporations and push them in that direction. So if you could talk to them about the work that you've had to do as an organization to build capacity to actually do this. I know that you have have done personal learning and have personal experience, but as you think about building a wealth management firm, what are some of the learning and the challenges you've faced there?
So what I'll say for us is that it starts at the top. Our CEO is on board, and not only is she on board, she is all in. And so when I told you, the work kind of found me, she was very clear that she did not want a white firm. I mean, and she jokes, we were overweight on white women and lesbians. So she didn't know where to begin. She didn't know where to start. And honestly, she just picked up the phone and called Spelman College, which is where I went to school, which is it is a historically Black college located in Atlanta for women, and basically spoke with the head of institutional advancement and just flat out told him, I want to hire and I don't know what to do. Well, he eventually sent her a couple of women who started working for our firm. One is still with us today. And over time, whenever we have a new opening, our CEO is very clear that, we need to diversify our firm. And that means that, we have to be a little bit more patient in terms of finding candidates. It means that it is work that all of the women do at our firm. I will say, as our firm has gotten to be more diverse, because typically people's networks mirror them. So as our firm has gotten more diverse, it has gotten easier for us to find the talent that we need. But I think in the beginning, it required our CEO saying, hey, we're going to do this and we are going to do whatever it takes. And that means we are going to go through all of our personal networks and we are going to be uncomfortable and maybe reach out to organizations that we don't know. In terms of doing the work, I would say the next step, we are a diverse organization now. I think we're primarily made up now of women and people of color. And we are also made up of women of different sexual orientation. Now, at this point, the work for us, in some ways, I feel like we're still in the very beginning, is understanding what does it mean to be a wealth management firm operating in capitalism? What does it mean to operate a firm and have equitable systems and processes? And so that is one of the things that our CEO has really charged us with. And this is an ongoing discussion that we are having. What does it mean? What does it mean in terms of how we interact with one another? What does it mean in terms of people's professional development? What does it mean in terms of how people's performance is, how we discuss performance, how we talk about performance, what we emphasize in terms of when we provide people feedback, even how we provide people feedback. In addition, our CEO also hired a woman to come in to be our chief operating officer who had ran a prestigious school. And she has really been, I would say, the keeper of our culture. And so when people in our organization have said things or done things that have been maybe offensive to other people, and by the way, you will make mistakes along the way. People will say things that they should not have said. She is really the person that we go to, and she's the person that we go to quite often, sometimes, even if our CEO has said something. So I think having her presence there and having the ability for all of us to feel comfortable going to talk to her when something has perhaps gone awry or someone has said something has been tremendously helpful. The other thing I will say is seeing our CEO make those blunders and seeing the way in which, when she's made those blunders, she has to come back to the rest of us and say, hey, I made a blunder here. I said something I should not have said. This is, something I'm learning. And an example that I give a lot is we used to have a nickname for our CEO, and boss was part of the word. Well, we don't use the word boss anymore. And, you can go look up the word boss and why. So with that being said, she has a new nickname now. But the point was that led to a whole discussion in our organization about the fact that we don't want to use that word. Why? The other thing that I will say that we're constantly doing is we talk about race all the time in terms of what is going on. And when I started off by saying that I'm learning, I'll be frank. I mean, I am a Black woman, but we have women who come from different countries throughout the continent of Asia. So we're talking about race, but we're not talking about race in just terms of Indigenous and Black people. We're talking about race in terms of Asian people, and not just looking at Asian people, in terms of monolithic sense. They all come from different countries. They all have different cultures, backgrounds. All of these women bring a different perspective to the world. And so it's important for all of us in my firm to understand what that is, and for them to also be able to ask questions and probe when we see things happening. The last thing that I'll say is something that our senior leadership says all the time, is that we are complicit. We operate in a wealth management industry. We understand that we are operating in a system that was built on the backs of Black people, and we understand that Indigenous people had their land stolen from them. And therefore, by doing the work that we do, we are complicit, we are a part of the system, and we need to embrace that, understand that, so that we can figure out how to operate differently. And quite honestly, I feel as if I saw a lot more firms and a lot more leaders who were willing to say that and to say it over and over and over again, that we would begin to think very differently about what it means to achieve racial equity.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think that both the building out internal capacity in terms of who you actually hire, and then in terms of having these conversations about race over and over and over again. And it strikes me that the first step in that process was reaching out to a community leader, in this case, Spelman College, just to get the resources that your CEO required. And I think to that point, Renee, if you could talk a little bit about how Adestina has worked to create community relationships that have really informed how you've built mass incarceration as a priority into the work that you're doing, how you've built those relationships, and then how it's informed the work you do.
Yeah, sure. So it's Adesina, just so people know it's Adesina Social Capital. That's fine. So yeah, I want to acknowledge I want Patience and Rebecca and Jacobed and Ivy. I'm really appreciating the difficulty or challenges of living your experience and then having to come to these professional panels. And so I appreciate the fact that your whole self is here. And I don't know, I just want to name that I'm sort of indebted, we're all indebted to Black women and the experience and the fact that you all have to keep showing up. And when we talk about emotional labor, I think it's important to name that. So I see what's happening here and want to know that, yes, we're here to talk about investing, but this is a real thing that is happening in people's lives. And I'm really torn right now between the activist in me and the professional investor person.
Bring your whole self. You can say your whole self too.
So I just need to say that. And I also wanted to say that when you talk about the bail fund, and I'm going to lead into investing with this, that people do die for $100. I'm in Denver, Colorado, and this happened. There was a Black man who was homeless and had some mental health issues that was arrested and couldn't pay $100 fine. And the sheriffs killed him in jail. And so it's important for everybody on the call to know that this is happening everywhere you are. This isn't just in North Carolina or Ferguson or Chicago, whatever city you live in, there's these stories, and knowing them is important. And so his name is Michael Marshall, and his niece, Natalia Marshall, has really kept his story alive. And so I want to just bring him into this conversation because this is happening everywhere and every day in America. So speaking of just the jail system and what Ivy and Rebecca were saying, this isn't just about mass incarceration in jail. The impacts of people's lives once they're even re-enter, it extends out. And I'm going to get to how we do this, but when we think about investing, it's not just private prisons. I mean, let's be honest, there's only 2 private prisons, and it's really easy to divest because they've become sort of poison for most people. So even people that don't do impact investing often aren't invested in they still are. Please pay attention, because a lot of BlackRock and Vanguard, there are people invested in those prisons. But when we're talking about people that are looking at prisons, so if we extend that out to the bail system, who's insuring the bail bondsmen? What are those insurance companies? Who are they? When people are, there's over 2 million people incarcerated, but there's over 12 million people that are formally incarcerated. And when you're formally incarcerated, often you have to check, it's called ban the box, but when you look for a job or you look for an apartment, they ask if you have a felony. And so there's a whole movement called ban the box. And what they're saying is don't ask that question, because once you check that box, then you can't get a job and you can't get an apartment. So which companies out there, what publicly traded companies still are asking that question? Which companies have not banned the box? Because that, I would say, is also a prison pre-fault. Who are these companies that are doing these things? Predatory lending. If you can't get credit, let's say you've been incarcerated for a few years, so now you can't get a job, or maybe, and I'm going to name a company people think are evil, but Walmart actually hires formerly incarcerated people, and they have an anonymous helpline. You can call and they'll help you fill out the application. But let's say you can't get credit because you don't have a job. Now you have to go cash your checks at a predatory lending company. So who's, what's in your portfolio that might be a predatory lending company? And let's say you want to go back to school and sort of better, like enter society in a different way, but you can't get college, you can't get student loans, or you can't get like traditional schools. So you go to a for-profit college. The for-profit colleges are completely predatory. They're charging massive amounts of money for tuition, and their graduation rates are terrible, like 20%. The hiring rate, even if you graduate, is like as low as 15%. So when you think about mass incarceration, I guess I'm just like sort of challenging everybody. This is so far beyond, this is an entire system of keeping people oppressed, of keeping people down, of creating a second-class citizenship. And so those are just some, I mean, there's many more. And so to get to your question, I promise I won't do this again. To get to your question, how did we do this? Or how do we work with people that are most impacted? I will say how it started is at the top. Rachel Robichodi is the CEO of the company. And so Adesina Social Capital is one of the only companies that's led by a Black queer woman. And so Rachel brings to her experience the way to invest, right? Like those, just as we all witnessed, people bring their experience to their work. You can't really separate those. And so Rachel had started Robichodi and Phillipson prior, which was a traditional wealth management firm. And I think at some point, it was untenable. It was like, I can't just help rich people keep getting richer without really looking at these. So that firm has really changed into Adesina Social Capital, which is what we are now. And there are 4 pillars which we invest every single dollar with. Like all of our money is invested in this way. And it's economic justice, gender justice, racial justice, and climate justice. And it has to meet all of those criteria before we invest in anything. What's different at Adesina is that we don't make those decisions in a boardroom, even though we do have everybody on the staff is from a non-traditional background. Some of those come from our lived experiences. Certainly we all have a certain amount of knowledge that we're bringing, but we partner with social justice organizations. And the reason we do that is initially we had community meetings to talk to really get to like, because we believe that like, we're not going to solve the problems with the same voices. So it's like, who's the most impacted? When we're talking about racial justice, if we're talking about gender justice, who are the people most impacted by the ills of those, like how do we get justice in those ways? And so just to give you an example, because I think you're going to ask this question, is if you just have a call, it's like who gets access to that call has its own barriers, right? You can't just say, hey, we're having a call, people that are marginalized join the phone call. Like that's just a weird thing to do and people aren't going to know about it. So after sort of trying that in different iterations, we decided to partner with social justice organizations that represent their communities. So just for example, we were talking to the Poor People's Campaign back over a year ago. We were meeting with the Poor People's Campaign saying, what's important to you? What are your issues? What do you think we should focus on? And wages was they were saying like, we need to really raise the minimum wage and start talking about the sub-minimum wage. So they work with One Fair Wage, which was more equipped to do some of the work that we need to do, because what we need is data sources as investors. So if we're going to say we need to end the sub-minimum wage, we need to know what companies are paying a sub-minimum wage. So we get funding for those social justice groups to help us come up with the data. So it's really driven by them. The topic's driven by them, the issues are driven by them, and then the data and how we collect it is driven by them. And then we obviously pay for people's labor and their work and their expertise on that. So then we come up with a list and we make it public. We democratize all of our data. So you can go to Investors for Livable Wages and you can see the whole list of people that are paying a sub-minimum wage. And then we get investors to sign on and say, we need you to end that practice. So there are ways to do that. One is shareholder activism and another way is divestment. We actually don't engage in shareholder activism the way that like North Star, like Ivy Jet, we all are friends. We all work together. They can target companies, but we've sort of driven a line, we have drawn a line saying there's just some things that are bad and we don't want to invest in them. And so we divest from those companies and then sort of put them on blast as much as we can. That is a lot of words from me, so I will pause there.
So thank you, I appreciate it. I think we'll come back to you actually if we have time, but quickly I just wanted to move to patience, and if you could talk a little bit about, we've heard some of the process that North Star and Destina Capital, Social Capital have gone through, but if you could talk about just sort of the broader context of prison-free investing, how you've seen that evolve, and then opportunities you see based on where we are today, the interests that we have now, and the growing sources of data, the relationships that are being built, where you see the field going. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Here I am. Very quickly to go back to some of the things that have been said, but to put some numbers to some of the comments. We have a system that's, yes, the private prison complex is one, but an extension of that includes, the labor and the things that we all consume every day that we're not being thoughtful about, who is doing the work behind them. So I just wanted to put some numbers in context here, but would like to start with one of these quotes that I go to all the time when I think about how insidious this whole situation is. This is by a sheriff in Louisiana in response to the 2017 Justice Reinvestment Act, where he said, which was supposed to release the good ones, the nonviolent inmates. And he said, well, we need to keep some of them in here. Those are the ones that can work, that pick up trash. The work release program, well, guess what? They're releasing those, in addition to the bad ones, they're releasing the good ones, the ones that we use every day to wash cars, change oil in our cars, to cook in the kitchen, to do all that where we save money. And that's really the problem, right? Where you have the prison industrial complex now intertwined with profit-seeking behavior. And this is because once that happens, you need to keep a steady supply of prisoners, right? The supply has to be kept up. The imperative to keep operating costs down kicks in. And more importantly, there's a need to make shareholders happy. And that's the part that we all need to be thinking about, that we are in some ways shareholders, whether you are a shareholder who buys products that are farmed or made through this labor, or you are a shareholder in the sense that you actually hold stock in some of the prison companies, industrial complex companies, or the companies that use that labor. We are all in some ways shareholders to this problem, and we need to be really thoughtful about it. So if you now start looking at the numbers, this problem is disproportionately fueled by Black and brown people, with Black people being 6.5 times more likely than any other race to be incarcerated in this country. And this fuels another insidious problem, which means that that supply that I talked about earlier on is impacting communities of color more than any other community, right? Because you have folks in prison not being paid much money for the labor. The average hourly wage for prison labor is 63 cents. And so you put people behind bars, they leave households in crisis that are not able to look after themselves. That in some ways creates, in every way, creates this cycle of supply, which is, essentially what the system may be built to actually do. And so when it comes to the evolution of tools, there are a number of things that that are critical, right? The work that Adesina and others are doing, the activists. So, you know, we don't want to separate the activists from the financial types, because it's really a value chain of needed capacity that we need to be mindful about investing into, whether it's investing, you know, our nonprofit dollars or investing the for-profit capital that's seeking returns. But we need to invest in the entities that are doing the work of, you know, collecting the data on these things, aggregating the data on these harms. We need to then do the work of identifying the companies that are proximate to the harm. And the harm, as I said, is more than just, you know, the companies, as everybody said, it's more than the companies, the private prison, you know, companies, but it's really the Costco's and the other companies that are buying from you know, the prison labor complex as well. And then we need to develop the tools that democratize the ability of citizens to vote with their capital, right? To identify those companies, to then decide, to then actually be able to look into their portfolios. And this is something that is possible not just for the large asset holders, like, you know, endowments and asset managers, et cetera, but it's really possible. It's work that is possible for anyone who has a 401k plan. You can go into your plan and use some of the tools that are being developed today to look at, what are you invested in? Are you, you know, for instance, are you a mother of 2 Black men like me, whose retirement money is actually invested in a system that ultimately we live in fear of every day, right? So that's part of the work that needs to be done. So for my part, starting last summer, I've been involved in in the building of 2 tools. One of them is as you saw, Prison Free Tool, and I have worked as on the advisory committee for that tool, and that work is work that Andy Behar, the CEO of As You Saw, had been trying to put together for a while. And last summer, they ended up taking money from some other part of, you know, their work, because it was really important to finally develop this tool. They have a tool that includes fossil-free, deforestation-free, military weapons, but it became really important to focus on developing a tool that would democratize this access to everybody else around this prison industrial complex. And that tool goes beyond the private prisons themselves to the financial institutions that are providing capital, to the catering companies that are providing food. And it's not that we don't want prisoners to be fed, but the insidious part of even catering companies, and you can go into the data, is that the prisoners are working in the kitchens to make the food. So, you know, Aramark, for instance, pays, you know, full price, full wages for their workers who make food at colleges for college students. They don't pay anything. It's forced labor in the kitchens where, you know, they have contracts in prisons where prisoners are working to provide food for other prisoners. And the insidious thing about that is, if you go back to where I started, the problem is, if you're not paying them in those prison kitchens, they don't have the capacity to support the families they've left outside of prisons, and it perpetuates this supply cycle. So the evolution of tools, you know, I'm happy to say that, you know, the As You Saw tool is one of those tools. Renee sits on that advisory committee as well, but Adesina has done incredible work to actually also surface some of the companies that are complicit in this space. And then, in addition to the tools, I think that to the point that Ivy made about being activists that actually engage with companies, is the need to then undertake the engagement. and how we democratize that potential for people, the everyday citizen, to engage with companies that own either, that are involved in the value chain of prison ownership and labor, is something that we need to be thoughtful about. So there are tools today. That's the good news. There's a need for developing even more tools. And as capital holders, as far as capital holders are concerned, there's really a need to think about, how you're using your capital to invest in, the data collection, the aggregation of data, the development of tools that allow us to make the information more visible.
Thank you. And how do you think about all of that work as it relates to gender outcomes, environmental outcomes, et cetera? The way that I think about it, beyond the harm of the prisons themselves, if you think about Texas, for example, and the severe temperatures that they're experiencing there, the people with the least recourse who are going to be experiencing that harm are going to be in prisons. And prisons also happen to be the site of many environmental outcomes, but would just love to hear how you're thinking about that connection.
Yeah, and to the connection with Texas, which is more immediate, I think we actually need to extend that to the connection with COVID, where when everybody else, when the other industries shut down to protect people from the virus, the prison industrial complex insisted on their labor, on the prisoners continuing to provide labor. They were not protected, and they were and that labor was unpaid labor. They were, packaging, they were making and packaging hand sanitizers and masks, things that were to protect everybody else. And then those same prisoners were not allowed to have their families visit them. And the only communication with them is through phone communication. And the fees that they pay for phone communication with their families, $25 for 15 minutes of communication is a national average. And so once again, you're impacting the economic capacity of those families. And so at Huawei, we think about the intersection of gender and all these problems, whether they're environmental problems and social problems, racial justice problems, and actually our investment process screens out as a first, we hold a do no harm screening out process. And it starts with screening out environmental, fossil-free, deforestation, et cetera, all the things that I mentioned. But this prison industrial complex issue is key and fundamental, because at the end of the day, while we have more men being incarcerated, this leaves families in crisis. Women are more likely to become single heads of households and assume additional caretaking roles. In addition to this burden, 34% of all families end up in debt and have fees, to the point that you were making earlier, fees associated with prison communication, prison bail, and the debt cycle is just compounded, and women bear quite a bit of that. And then if you start thinking about the characteristics that of the communities where the supply of prisoners come from, you are essentially exacerbating the risk of those communities, and women are at the forefront of keeping those communities protected and enabled. And at the end of the day, you saw me break down at the beginning of this call. That was not intentional at all. It just is a very, the emotional burden that we cannot, put into numbers is incredible, right? We have mothers who are bearing the pain and the fear, the everyday fear that when your child leaves the house, they may not come back. And my children are privileged children. In fact, they go to private school. and the harm has, did not seem proximate to them until they witnessed what happened with Mr. Floyd, the murder of Mr. Floyd last year, and they started really having conversations about, so Mom, what do I do when a cop stops me? What do, because my son was about to drive. What do I do if I'm just wearing a hoodie? What do I do? I mean, we had been involved in Trayvon Martin marches and so on, but now they're growing up to be men, and they're recognizing that, just being Black alone is enough. And for a mother, the pain that one carries actually intersects with one's health, right? There are all these cascading impact on communities that we cannot even measure in dollars. So at a minimum, if those of us who control allocation of capital can begin to internalize the fact that it is not just our profits that we need to, but we need to be mindful of how we're making our profits in alignment with our values, and take into account that these are not theoretical conversations. We are a family that's otherwise privileged, but because I am the mother of 2 Black men, none of this harm is not proximate. All of this harm is proximate. And so, for us, it's critical as an investment entity to be really mindful about what we invested in. Sorry, I went on there. Every time I talk about my 2 boys, I'm likely to go on.
Oh, please, we'd love to hear about it. And I think this brings up a question. We have about 10 minutes left, so if others have questions, please drop them in the chat. But something that's come up just over the course of this conversation is just the deeply emotional nature of this work. And I didn't prepare any of you for this, but the question I guess I have is how, starting with you, Rebecca, how you deal with that, how you think about caring for yourself, and how you deal with the emotional aspects of this work. Because I know I can't think the name Elijah McClain without crying. And so I do have to stop at times and say, I don't have the space for this emotion right now. What else can I be doing in this moment? And for you, Rebecca, you do this work every day, and I don't know how. So
You guys always have me crying right before I have to speak.
Like that, but
no, this work is really emotional. It's tough, and being a Black woman doing this work and receiving it. I'm not a mother, but I have a brother, and I have Black male friends that are close to me that, no matter what level of privilege we come from, what we went to, we were fortunate to go to college, great schools, to go in to get good degrees. It does not change the fact that our skin is Black. And so these realities are, it's tough to deal with it in every day from my clients, who I have a lot of compassion for, because I know, unlike some attorneys, and not that doesn't make them bad attorneys or anything. It just, I understand how the effects that the criminal justice system has on people, and just kind of sitting back and listening to everyone speak, and I wish I could say, oh, this is what you should do to not invest in these things. But it's really interesting that we're in 2021, and the idea that people are still investing essentially in slavery and don't realize it. Don't realize that there are non-carceral solutions to addressing the harm of addressing harm, period, whether it's to an individual person or a community. And so when I think about those things, it makes it hard to have these conversations, but it definitely fuels me in my fight in the courtroom with advocating for my clients and connecting my clients to resources. I think the main thing that I do to take care of myself is make sure that I have my alone time. And during that time, I wrote down Renee Michael Marshall's name. And I have a list of names of people, maybe former clients, people formerly incarcerated that are struggling, trying to find their way, being out now, or people that are still incarcerated. I lift them up. And I take that time to ground myself and remember why I started off doing the work. And I think just having those silent moments definitely help. This is hard work. And like you said, patience, it does affect your health. So, as much as you can, make sure you're getting your physical activity and fresh air. But it's been particularly hard drawing that balance during the pandemic when so many of my clients need so much more for me. Hence is why I was out at 4:00 in the morning handing out water and giving Uber rides to them, because they needed people to show up for them in different ways. And I think maybe like if this is my final word too, I'm just going to throw this in. But when you're thinking about investing and you want to think about the people and the families that this impacts. And if you've never thought about the criminal justice system affecting you or your family or your loved one, it's more than likely because you're not poor, Black or brown. And for those that are, just think about that this is a system that's designed to keep those people, to oppress those people. And investing in prisons over people, we're never going to be able to get to a point where everyone can be treated equal and be treated like humans if we're going to continue to fund these systems. So that's my spiel. But to take care of yourself is just those moments of silence and remembering why you do the work, why it's so important, and just taking care of your physical is so important to sustain the work.
Thank you. I think that's helpful in terms of thinking about knowing that the work that you're doing has an impact, and doing that sort of impactful work, being able to support you in the other things that you're doing. And I'm wondering, Renee, if you've thought about it in that sense, because I know that you've done some jail support work as well, as having that direct impact makes the rest of it easier to handle. So I'll ask you that, and then if anyone else has final thoughts, please share.
Yeah, I mean, for me, action always, the amount of rage, I think once you dive into it, and I guess I just want to say, because I don't want to take up space being the white person on the panel, but if you're white, this impacts you. Like the legacy of hate and oppression that you have to understand that we carry is, there needs to be reparations. Like there needs to be, like, I think you used the word atonement at the beginning. Like that, nothing stops without white folks understanding white supremacy and understanding how to dismantle that. And that's like listening and following and giving space to the people most impacted. So I guess I'll just end with that like this is everybody's work. It should absolutely not be like Black folks only on panels about racial justice. Racial justice is about white people having a reckoning with the past.
So I just want to add to that. I read some work of a professor, Dr. Kira Banks, and she said that, to your point, Renee, it requires work, right? Racial justice is an outcome, she says. When people have access and opportunity regardless of race, that's when you've reached equity. Racial equity is an outcome. Yet this outcome requires an intentional process of targeted practices and strategies. It requires that we develop an awareness of how race as a social construct impacts experiences and outcomes for others. Examine how systems and institutions create and perpetuate inequities on the basis of race. And finally, how we can transform our institutions so that within and across, we can no longer predict outcomes by race, right? And right now, we all have to sit in the fact that we can predict outcomes by race.
Thank you. Can you share that name again? That was such a helpful.
Dr. Kira Banks. I'll put her name in the chat.
Thank you. Ivy, do you have any final thoughts? Oh no.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I put in the chat box, I don't remember which woman said this, but but racism makes us all sick. And there is a wonderful TED Talk by Dr. David Williams entitled How Racism Makes Us Sick. And I have heard him speak, and one of the things, by the way, he's a professor at the public health school at Harvard University, is that we all have anti-Black bias. The numbers that I heard him recently discuss, I think 30% of Black Americans have anti-Black bias, and 70% of white Americans have anti-Black bias. So I want to, I appreciate Renee's comments that, it's a white and Black problem. It's a problem that we all have to address. And even myself, in terms of being close in proximity to it, it is something that I'm working on. The other thing I was going to comment on is, by the way, I want to thank everyone for being patient with me. I'm actually on vacation right now. So as the sunrise is coming up, I have had to adjust the light. And I will say 2020, I think, was particularly trying, not necessarily just because of coronavirus and the fact that, proportionally more Black people have died. But I think, when I just think about everyday stressors, depending on your network, whether it's Elijah McClain, there are several people who have died even after George Floyd who have not gotten the same level of publicity. But if you are Black, you know the names of all of those people because you cannot get away from it, in the sense that whether it's a family member, whether it is my brother, whether it is one of the women at my job, we are following. So part of me, I think in terms of being mindful about health is also just having to shut everything down and just step away, because I also think if you are a Black American, this is a way that you are constantly reminded and it's reinforced that there is a place for you in this society and that you are a second-class citizen and that you have to continually be reminded. And so while I do believe that, we probably all are getting these signals, it has become particularly acute, I would say, in 2020, because not a day goes by, not a day, that I am not continually reminded that, again, to be Black in this country is, while, I will say at this age, I wouldn't want to be anything else because it is a joy, but at the same time, it is also a burden that we have to carry. And when I think of the energy it saps that could be going to other productive things and uses, it's disappointing because I think we lose out on talent. And for the people who are engaged, it's just a distraction. So, but again, I want to leave you with, we all have a part in it. And in terms of education, the education is endless. So I want to ask everybody, please go check out Dr. David Williams' TED Talk. And also, I'm a big fan and proponent of the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones of the New York Times Magazine as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we've dropped a couple links in the chat, and I just dropped one from Worth Rises on the prison industry, and they have a whole curriculum on the entirety of the prison industry. So if you're interested in learning more, go there. Well, thank you all so much for sharing, for being vulnerable, for being open, for dedicating time to this conversation, and just really, really appreciate everything that you shared. And to end on a light note, I guess I'd say that, these systems were created. These inequities are not natural. They were created, and they're not even that old in the grand scheme of human life. So we absolutely can dismantle them. We can take them apart. It is within each of us. We have the power to do that. And so resting in the knowledge that you can be a part of the solution just as much as we're part of the problem now, and taking that into the future. So thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate your time today, and go forth and prosper. Thanks.